Thinking then this morning of serving our Lord in verses 1 to 6 of 1 Thessalonians and chapter 2. What do you think a minister's job is like? Some people think it is a cushy number that we work just one day a week, and the rest of the week we can engage in our interests, in our hobbies, in our pleasures. And certainly this was the reality in some cases in the 17th and 18th century. Ministers' salaries were very low then. Ministers got other jobs and occupied themselves Monday to Friday in teaching in schools or in universities, prepared their sermons on a Saturday, preached them on the Sabbath day. Others think the job is really difficult, and this puts some men off from applying for the ministry, or in some cases resigning when they're just a short time in the ministry because of the difficulties of that job. But in general, a minister's job lies somewhere, as in many jobs, in between. There are joys and sorrows. There are challenges and encouragements. And this is the experience of the Apostle Paul as he writes 1 Thessalonians. In chapter 1, he has been focusing on the joys of the congregation in Thessalonica. They have showed faith and love and hope. They have displayed the graces of regeneration, and this has thrilled the apostle. And in that first chapter, he has thanked God for their progress in the presence of affliction and persecution. But now he's moving on to deal with the dark side of his ministry, the problems and challenges that he has encountered. He's just been a short time with the believers in Thessalonica. He has left suddenly the congregation there, and this has raised all kinds of criticisms and ridicule and objections and questioning of Paul's character and Paul's ministry. And in chapter 2 and 3, he gives an apology for his ministry and his character and his decisions, an apology in the sense of a defense. And so we come today to think of verses 1 to 6. You see how he keeps using the words, you know. Verse number 1, you yourselves know. Verse 2, you know. Verse 5, as you know. He also uses the term God is witness frequently. Verse number 5, God is witness. Verse 9, you remember. Verse 11, you know. You see, he's arguing against the views which were rampant within the congregation and within the city, the criticisms against his ministry and his character, but he's appealing to the personal knowledge of the congregation in Thessalonica. Whatever others are saying, you know what the reality was. You remember how we lived and ministered and behaved. And so it's an interesting background and context in which the Apostle Paul is writing here. And today we want to see from this that in ministry there will be criticism, there will be opposition, that there will be rumors, there will be misunderstandings about our decisions, our character, our leadership. It's all part of being a minister, being a servant of Christ, being a leader within the Christian church. But the apostle reminds us that God is his judge. God sees his heart. God knows his intentions and his choices. And for us in our life, in our ministry, in our work, this is our encouragement that ultimately God knows the reality. So we want to study today verses 1 to 6 in which he sets out in negative terms what his ministry was not like. He keeps saying it wasn't like this. And then this evening with the lads from the camp, we'll be thinking in verses 7 to 12 about the positive ways in which he sets out three metaphors. The boys are going to love this. The camp leaders are bringing the boys along. They'll get a good talking to in the church here. This will make it an easy week for the leaders. But the sermon tonight is not about the campers. It's about the leaders. But anyway, don't be telling them that until they turn up. So we want to think about three aspects of serving. And we've been serving this week, either in prayer and thought in your home or here in our church building. We've been thinking and engaged in serving. And it's good for us just to reflect on that as we think of this passage about serving. The motives, first of all, of our serving. And this is verses 1 and 2. He has the negative, first of all, in verse number 1. Our coming to you was not in vain. And I keep thinking that the book of Thessalonians was light and easy, but there's incredible depths to verses which we've all read many times. For example, here in verse 1, our coming to you has great weight and significance in the first century. Our entrance into the city of Thessalonica he's referring to, and this was a major thing in that time. Rhetoricians, orators were the pop idols, the celebrities of the first centuries. It wasn't sports people, it wasn't musicians, it was speakers. They were the celebrities of the first century, and they would go around different cities. Taylor Swift coming to Dublin, there'll be great welcome for her. Rhetoricians coming to Thessalonica, the streets would be lined with people to welcome this orator into the city. Paul's referring to this in verse 1. Our coming to you, our entrance to you as an orator, as a rhetorician, as a public speaker, he says, was not in vain. This is the first negative that he asserts about his ministry. It wasn't in vain. What does he mean? Now, three views about this phrase have been suggested. I think the third view is the best one, as I'll try and argue just in a moment. The first suggestion is that he did not come empty-handed, not in vain, not empty. He came with the gospel. He came with miracles. The second view is that it was not in vain in the sense that there were no results. Some did believe the message that he brought. But I think the best understanding of this phrase is that he came not empty. He came with earnestness. He came with sincerity. He didn't come for fame or for wealth or for applause. He came with sincerity. He came with earnestness. He came with pure motives to the city of Thessalonica. There were all kinds of questions raised about his coming, as we've been mentioning. His time there was brief, just a few months. He left suddenly. He left the people to suffer and to pick up the pieces after him, and they were suffering. And all of this has provided a cause for the enemies of the church to ridicule and question Paul's ministry. Isn't he just a charlatan like the many other rhetoricians that go around the cities of the Roman Empire? And Paul replies to that and says, I came not in vain. There was sincerity. There was earnestness in my entrance, in my coming to the city of Thessalonica. And he gives the reason for this in the second verse. We had already suffered in Philippi, but we were bold in our God to declare to you the gospel. His argument is, here's the reason why, and the evidence of our sincerity and pure motives is because we'd already suffered down the road in Philippi. If we were insincere in our motives, we would have given up. We would have packed it in. We would have slunk away into the shadows. We would have taken time out because of the suffering we'd experienced in Philippi. But no, though we suffered in Philippi, such was our love to spread the gospel. Such was the sincerity of our purpose to see the glory of God, that we came to another city with our backs hurting, with shame surrounding our reputation. We persevered to bring you the gospel. See the three phrases he uses in verse number 2. Suffered, shamefully treated, much conflict. Suffered, the references to the public beating with rods by the officials in Philippi. The experience had a special name, the verberatio. The officials came with a bundle of rods, and in the main square pulled down the shirts of the criminals and beat their backs with these rods. Jeannie Green explains the beating was a punishment given out to those of low status who would be considered guilty on the basis of an accusation alone without a trial. Paul says that's what happened to us in Philippi. There was no tribunal, there was no court case, but on the basis of rumor alone, we were beaten. We suffered in Philippi. The second phrase is shamefully treated. This beating was done before many people. It was seen by the crowds. They had this public humiliation imposed upon them, and there they were, supposed preachers of the gospel, humiliated by the masses in Philippi. Here was a social hurdle which was placed in front of them, which they had to overcome. But despite the physical pain, despite this social hurdle of their reputation being in shatters, they came to the city of Thessalonica. And there he says, and this is the third term in verse 2, we experienced in the midst of much conflict. The opposition which they had in Philippi down the road continued in Thessalonica. Shorgan comments, the hostility they found in Thessalonica was the perpetuation of their experience in Philippi. The word conflict in verse 2 is the Greek word agonai, from which we get our word agony. They were suffered in Philippi. They continued to suffer in Thessalonica. So Paul says, our coming to you was not in vain. It wasn't empty. It wasn't shallow. It wasn't for human praise. It wasn't for human wealth. It was sincere. It was pure. It was earnest. Our motives to serve God can be misjudged. She loves the limelight, people might say, of being in charge, of giving orders, of leading. He's in it for himself, people might say, for the prestige, for the pay packet. Sometimes our motives are misjudged. But how important for us, as the apostle does here, to tune out those rumors and aspersions and to recognize that God is our witness. He knows the reality. There's a wonderful moment in the life of Charles Spurgeon, the London preacher, and you can't imagine the number of rumors that were leveled against him, the wild and dark accusations that he daily lived with, and they built up in his life until there came a moment when he got down before God and he said to God, God, I've given you much, and now I give you my character. And rather than trying to answer all those rumors and accusations, he left his character with God. But the apostle teaches us to keep going in our service, in our ministry, despite what some are saying, despite the challenges that our ministry and service brings, and the discouragement that comes at whatever level we are serving. The apostle persevered from Philippi to Thessalonica, the motives of our serving. Secondly, the manner of our service. And this is verses 3 and 4. And again, the apostle has negatives in the first part and then a positive statement in the second part. The negative is in verse 3. Our appeal to come to Christ did not spring from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive. It wasn't from error. The doctrine which the apostle preached was pure, it was truth, it was right. Guided by the Spirit, what he taught about Scripture, about God, about humanity, about Christ, about redemption, about the church, about the last things. It was error-free. He was bringing God's truth to the people. Throughout his letters, he will talk about the many false teachers that were attacking the churches. He speaks in Ephesians 4:14 of the danger of being carried about by every wave of doctrine. The surfer is waiting for the wave and is carried by that wave up to the shore and then looks for the next wave and is carried by that wave up onto the shore. So the apostle warns the congregation in Ephesus about being carried on different waves. He appeals to them to hold on to the truth because there is much error. The second thing he says, it wasn't from impurity in verse number 3. This can have a narrow context of sexual impurity, which was associated with the false teachings of the first century. But it has the broader understanding of impure motives. The apostle coming for self-praise. The apostle coming for wealth. The apostle coming for applause. Or to deceive in verse number 3. This was not the manner of his service. He performed miracles, as we thought of last time. And those could be misrepresented as the apostle trying to deceive the people. The apostle was eloquent, and his eloquence could be misconstrued as an intention to deceive the people. But he asserts that far from seeking to deceive the people or teach error or any strand of impurity, he in verse number 4, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. The word approved was used of metals which were heated up to remove impurities or to test them if they were pure. The word was also used of people who, before they were appointed to public office, they were tested and examined to see that they had the right character and ability to fulfill that office. So the apostle says, far from being those who peddle error or deception or impurity, we've been tested by God. We've been approved by God and commissioned by God to proclaim his word. We live in an age when there is much deception and error and impurity in some leaders. Elon Musk has been accused of tampering with the data about electric cars, indicating that he suggested that they could go a lot further than the reality of the tests that he had done actually showed. Within the church, there is the temptation to include error in our service. Some doctrines are unpopular. The new birth, the doctrine of hell, the doctrine of sin. And we can be tempted to avoid those, to dumb them down in our witness and service. We can have impure motives in our desires and aspirations, longing that the church will grow so that the bank balance of the congregation will increase. We can have an element of deception in our teaching. In every membership class, inevitably there are some parts of our membership booklet which I usually think will be problematic to the person in the class. Perhaps it will just be about us singing psalms only, or having no organ, or our view on voting. And when we come to those parts, there's always the temptation to turn over a few pages. But the manner of the apostles' service was without error, without deception, without impurity. And thirdly, the matter of our service, and this is verses 5 to 6. And again, he has the negative at the start, verse 5, and then the more positive assertion later on. And again, he has three negatives, and this is a characteristic of Thessalonians, that there's often sets of three that the apostle uses. He says it was without words of flattery. It was without a pretext for greed. It was without seeking glory from people. It was without words of flattery. This was a common approach by rhetoricians and orators in the first century, flattering the crowds, flattering the people in the hope that they would pay them more, that they would have a greater following. One writer describes it, and when I catch sight of a man who is rich and thick, I at once get my hooks into him. If this money bags happens to say anything, I praise him vehemently. Proverbs warns against flattery, doesn't it? In chapter 26, verse 28, a flattering mouth works evil. Without pretext for greed. Greed can be behind a good action. It can be behind a seemingly a good word or message or encouragement. But that ulterior motive lies deep down in the aspiration and heart of the person. And the apostle says this was not our way. We did not speak and interact and act with this underpinning greed for fame, for applause, for wealth. And thirdly, he says it wasn't to seek glory from people. It wasn't to have the applause, the well done, the praise which the rhetoricians craved. One writer describes an orator demanding praise from his audience. Praise me, the rhetorician said, and the crowd responds, what do you mean by praise? Cry out, marvelous. But the apostle stood aside from that common thirst for the praise from the crowd. In contrast to this, he says in verse number 6, we could have demanded applause. We could have demanded financial remuneration. We could have demanded a following because we are the apostles of Christ, the ambassadors, the direct representatives of Jesus. We could have demanded that, but we didn't. Flattery. We can be so scared of flattering someone that we never give a compliment. And I would add, we never give a compliment when something is not done perfectly, even though the person does their best. An action might not be as good as you or I could do it, but it's as good as that person could do it. Let's not be dumb in our praise because the service of others is imperfect. Greed can lie behind some of our actions. That greed for applause, that greed for being well thought of, that greed for being appreciated. And praise, the praise of others, is something that all of us like. One writer says, if you don't live by the praise of men, you won't die by the criticism of men. or service for the Lord. One key lesson which arises from this passage describing the apostles' experience is that God brings good from our suffering, or unjust suffering, perhaps. Here is this section, this model of service which we have here, which arises from the crucible of God's servant suffering. And isn't this what we find throughout the Bible? Many of the Psalms written there, comforting us, guiding us how to live and speak to God in the presence of suffering. It arises from the most agonizing experiences of the writer. The book of Job was a dark and prolonged time in the experience of God's servant, and yet it provides riches for us to draw on in our experience and our challenges. So in our lives, we are to have this trust, this confidence, this assurance that God, who orders all our experience, will bring from our weakness and darkness and need something which will help others, something which will bring glory to our God, because this is what he ultimately done in his Son, Jesus Christ, who was misunderstood and misrepresented far more than the apostle was in the city of Thessalonica. He was considered mad. He was considered demon-possessed. He was considered someone who was raising the nation against the Romans, which led to his crucifixion outside of Jerusalem. But in that moment of misunderstanding and rejection, glory was brought to God. And salvation is brought to everyone here who repents of their sins and believes in his Son, Jesus Christ. Let us also then trust that in our suffering, or unjust suffering perhaps, God also will bring glory to his name and benefit to others. John Calvin says we must never allow ourselves to be deceived by the imaginary happiness of the ungodly. In our unjust suffering, we wonder, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep going here? If we give this service up, our life will be a lot easier. It will be like those who have no bad experiences. Calvin says it's an imaginary happiness which the ungodly have. And he goes on to exhort us to trust in the providence of God, that he will bring good from our suffering.